The Trail of Tears remains one of the most somber and tragic episodes in American history. A forced relocation during the 1830s that uprooted thousands of Native Americans from ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River. Enacted under the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, entire nations, including the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, were compelled to leave their lands, despite legal resistance and a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that upheld their rights. This harrowing journey, marked by exposure to brutal weather, disease, starvation, led to the deaths of over 4,000 Cherokee alone, with countless others from other tribes perishing along the way. The profound suffering and injustice endured has etched the Trail of Tears into the collective memory as a poignant symbol of devastating consequences of forced displacement and the cultural erasure of indigenous peoples. Hello and welcome. Here we are again. This time we're talking about the Trail of Tears. A pretty horrible name for a very horrible thing. But we'll learn all about it from start to finish. As always, if you really want to help me out, you do the whole like, comment, subscribe thing. I see that quite a few of you are not subscribed. So if you just want to click that little button, there we go, you clicked it, didn't you? Then it really helps me out in the algorithm. Now, with that being said, with all the begging out of the way, a little bit distasteful, let's get nice and relaxed and start. And we start this, in the 1830s, which by this time, the area that would be later known as the American Deep South was inhabited by a coalition of indigenous nations. Now, this coalition was known collectively as the 5 Civilized Tribes. Now, these tribes were the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Muscogee, and Seminole. Now, these nations maintained their independence, but they were increasingly, over time, adopting aspects of the new white American culture little by little, a transformation that was encouraged in earlier times by leaders like George Washington and Henry Knox. Now, their cultural assimilation was particularly evident among the Cherokee and Choctaw peoples, but of course it was a spectrum, and not everybody was keen to abandon the old ways. Either way, despite this integration, the American settlers were eager to expand into new lands. And by new lands, I mean indigenous lands. While exerting pressure, of course, on the federal government to remove these nations from the southeast. You see, the problem was that settlers were often encroaching upon indigenous territories or just seeking additional land for their own settlement needs. Well, in the face of significant opposition from figures such as U.S. Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, President Andrew Jackson secured the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830. I mean, usually with an act like that, they'll give it a name that doesn't sound that bad. Think of the Patriot Act and things like the Safe Schools Act, the Safe Communities Act. Yeah, they're not really trying to hide that one, aren't they? Well, of course, the legislation did exactly what it said it was going to do. It authorized the government to completely nullify any indigenous land claims on the southeast. Of course, the Choctaw were the first nation to be displaced under this act in 1831, which set a precedent for the subsequent removals. Following two conflicts, many Seminoles were forced out in 1832. The Creek faced removal in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and the Cherokee in 1838, being of course the most famous of removals for the wrong reasons. Now, while some individuals managed to avoid relocation, such as certain Choctaw who remained in Mississippi, Creek in Alabama and Florida, Cherokee in North Carolina, and Seminole in Florida, a small group, fewer than 500 Seminole, successfully evaded forced relocation altogether. Of course, the modern Seminole Nation of Florida descends from these very individuals. But alongside the indigenous individuals, many non-indigenous residents of these nations also moved westward. This group included about 4,000 enslaved individuals and others of African heritage, such as spouses and freedmen. Of course, this is long before that issue was sorted. By 1837, a total of 46,000 indigenous people from the southern states had been uprooted from their ancestral lands, making 25 million acres available for European settlement. Upon arriving in what was designated as Indian Territory, the 5 tribes occupied land that belonged to Plains Indian nations, and often obscured the histories of people who had previously inhabited the region. This fostered the narrative that they had settled in an uninhabited wilderness, aligning themselves with white American values by participating in the process of settler colonialism themselves. Other indigenous groups who had moved to Indian Territory before the 5 tribes, well, one can imagine that they regarded these newcomers as intruders. Of course, this is going to cause more than a few problems. Before 1838, the boundaries of these autonomous Indian nations spanned extensive areas of the United States, but were continually altered through cession and annexation. This was partly due to the encroachment of squatters and the use of military force in the newly established U.S. territories, which overlapped with indigenous treaty claims. As these territories became states, state governments sought to dissolve boundaries of the Indian nations within their jurisdictions, nations that were autonomous from state authority, and also to appropriate their lands. It was probably more about the latter. Now, these pressures were intensified by U.S. population growth and the expansion of slavery in the South, especially under Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which accelerated cotton farming in the uplands, kind of uprooted the old industry. Many members of the southeastern Indian nations had become economically integrated into the regional economy, participating in the plantation system, and even owning enslaved people themselves, who were also forcibly displaced during the removals. Now, the removal program, which was established before Andrew Jackson's presidency, was justified by the myth of the vanishing Indian. Now, historian Jeffrey Ostler explains that this narrative portrayed the decline of indigenous American populations as an inevitable result of natural processes, allowing Americans to avoid moral responsibility for these policies. Well, while Jackson is often associated with the Trail of Tears, the idea of removal existed long before his administration, although he's often blamed entirely for it. Yes, he signed off on it, but it wasn't his idea. I mean, that doesn't absolve anybody of any wrongdoing, but it does need to be mentioned. Now, we should also note that focusing solely on Jackson obscures the facts. The whole concept of this did not originate with him. Months after the Removal Act was enacted, Jackson referred to it as the fortunate culmination of a program pursued for nearly 30 years. Now, although Jackson was not the sole or original architect of the Indian removal policy, his significant influence did greatly advance its development. His advocacy for the displacement of natives began at least a decade before he became president. Once in office, removing indigenous people became his top legislative priority. In his inaugural address to Congress, Jackson asserted that forcing Native Americans to abandon their ancestral lands would be cruel and unjust. So, any emigration should be voluntary. However, he did emphasize that those choosing to remain within state boundaries must comply with state laws. He assured that individuals who did so would be protected in the enjoyment of those possessions which they had already improved by their industry. Jackson's focus on the deportation of American Indians and his contentious history stirred unrest throughout U.S. territories. During his presidency, the United States negotiated 86 treaties with 26 Native American nations between New York and the Mississippi River, all requiring land cessions and including provisions for removal. In fact, in a discourse concerning the expulsion of Native Americans, Jackson stated, "It will separate the Indians from the immediate contact with the settlement of whites, free them from the power of the states, enable them to pursue happiness in their own way and under their own rude institutions, will slow the progress of decay, which is lessening their numbers, and perhaps cause them gradually under the protection of the government and through the influence of good counsels to cast off their savage habits and become an interesting, civilized, and Christian community." Despite the Indian Removal Act of 1830 stipulating that relocation should be voluntary and completely based on mutual agreements, President Jackson, along with Martin Van Buren, proceeded with the forced removal of the Native American nations. The act empowered the president to negotiate land exchanges with indigenous groups and improve infrastructure on their existing territories. It also authorized covering transportation of expenses for those willing to move west, but only if they agreed to relocate voluntarily. Crucially, the legislation did not permit the president to compel native nations to move westward without mutually agreed upon treaties. Reflecting on this policy, Martin Van Buren, who succeeded Jackson, remarked that there was no measure during Jackson's administration of which he was more solely the architect of than this one. Well, Jackson proceeded, undeterred by opposition, with his policy of Indian removal by negotiating the Treaty of New Echota on December 29, 1835. This treaty granted the Cherokee Nation a 2-year period to relocate to Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma. While the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations agreed voluntarily and signed treaties with the U.S. government, the Creek Nation did so under coercion, and rather obviously so. The Treaty of New Echota was primarily advanced by Jackson and signed by a minority faction within the Cherokee, known as the Treaty Party. However, the majority of the Cherokee people opposed the treaty because it lacked endorsement from the Cherokee National Council and was not signed by the principal chief John Ross. In February 1836, the Cherokee National Council submitted a petition signed by hundreds of Cherokee citizens urging Congress to nullify the treaty. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Despite the dissent, the Senate ratified the treaty in March of 1836, establishing it as the legal basis for what would be known as the Trail of Tears. Only a small number of Cherokees relocated voluntarily. In 1838, the U.S. government, assisted by state militias, forcibly removed the majority of the remaining Cherokee people. They were initially confined in camps in eastern Tennessee. In November, the Cherokee were organized into groups of about 1,000 individuals each and began their westward journey, enduring severe weather conditions, including heavy rain, snow, and freezing temperatures. Through the Treaty of New Echota, the Cherokee ceded all their territory east of the Mississippi River in exchange for land in present-day Oklahoma and a payment of $5 million from the federal government. Of course, many Cherokee understandably felt betrayed by their leaders' acceptance of this agreement, leading to over 16,000 to sign a treaty demanding its ratification. By the end of the 1830s, tens of thousands of Cherokee and other indigenous nations had been displaced from their homelands east of the Mississippi River. Of course, the Creek, Choctaw, and Seminole and Chickasaw were also removed under the Act of 1830. A Choctaw leader described the removal as a trail of tears and deaths, which is where we get the name from. The establishment of Indian Territory and the nullification of native land claims east of the Mississippi River under the Removal Act foreshadowed the U.S. Indian Reservation System, which was later imposed on remaining indigenous lands during the 19th century. Now, back to a few legal issues. Now, the struggles over Native American sovereignty continued until the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, which declared that the Cherokee were not a sovereign or independent nation. Thus, they lacked standing to bring a case before the court. Following the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee pursued multiple legal actions against the state of Georgia. Several cases reached the Supreme Court, with Worcester versus Georgia in 1832 being the most significant among them. It was in this case that Samuel Worcester and several non-indigenous individuals were convicted under Georgia law for residing on Cherokee land without a permit from the U.S. government. Worcester was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but appealed the decision, arguing that the punishment violated treaties between the Indian nations and the U.S. federal government by imposing state laws on Cherokee territory. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Worcester, stating that the Cherokee Nation was solely governed by federal law, and that the Supremacy Clause prevented state legislative interference. Chief Justice John Marshall declared, "The Cherokee Nation is a distinct community, occupying its own territory, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force." I'm sure that was a popular statement among those in the government. He also emphasized that all interactions between the United States and the nation were, according to Constitution and laws, the responsibility of the federal government. Now, the Supreme Court did not direct federal marshals to enforce its decision in the Worcester case, leaving President Jackson with no specific duties to carry out. Despite this, his political opponents sought evidence before the upcoming election to accuse him of neglecting the Worcester ruling. Jackson feared that enforcing the decision might lead to open conflict between federal troops and the Georgia militia. Nobody wants that, worsening the crisis in South Carolina and potentially sparking a broader civil war. Now, instead, he engaged in active negotiations for a land exchange with the Cherokee. Later, political rivals Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, who supported the Worcester decision, criticized Jackson for his perceived failure to uphold Cherokee claims against Georgia. Writer and political leader Ralph Waldo Emerson documented the Cherokee's integration into American society and expressed his own support for the Worcester ruling. Now, at that time, various members of Indian tribes were not considered citizens of the United States on paper. Now, even though citizenship tests were administered to Native Americans in newly annexed territories before and after the relocations, individual states did not recognize the land claims of the Indian nations, allowing only individual land titles under state law. Additionally, there was a legal distinction between the rights of white citizens and the non-white citizens, with the latter often having limited legal standing. The removal of indigenous peoples was carried out under U.S. military authority, frequently involving state militias. Consequently, even Native Americans who could prove U.S. citizenship, well, that didn't really matter too much. You were still getting kicked out. Bad luck, I suppose. So, back to the Choctaw Nation. Let's talk about them for a little while. Now, they originally occupied large areas of present-day Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Through a series of treaties beginning all the way back in 1801, their territory was reduced to 11 million acres. Now, the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, ratified in early 1831, ceded any of their remaining lands to the United States. Evictions were authorized only after a clause in the treaty allowed certain Choctaw individuals to remain. The Choctaw were the first to sign a removal treaty proposed by the federal government. President Jackson sought firm negotiations with the Choctaw in Mississippi, who turned out to be more agreeable than he had originally anticipated. The agreement did stipulate that the United States would cover the costs of relocating their homes, which had to be completed within 2.5 years of the treaty's signing. Before the removals began, George Harkins, leader of the Choctaw Nations, addressed the American people, and these are his words. "It is with considerable diffidence that I attempt to address the American people, knowing and feeling sensibly my incompetency, and believing that your highly and well-improved minds would not be well entertained by the address of a Choctaw. But having determined to emigrate west of the Mississippi River this fall, I have thought proper in bidding you farewell to make a few remarks expressive of my views, and the feelings that actuate me on this subject of our removal. We, as Choctaws, rather choose to suffer and be free than to live under the degrading influence of laws, which our voice could not be heard in their formation." End of the address from George Harkins to the American people. Jeez, have some confidence in yourself. He shouldn't be talking so poorly about himself like that. Well-improved minds. What nonsense. United States Secretary of War Lewis Cass designated George Gaines to oversee the relocations. Gaines resolved to expel the Choctaws in 3 phases, Commencing in November 1831 and concluding in 1833, the initial groups convened at Memphis and Vicksburg when a severe winter assailed the emigrants with flash floods, sleet, and snow. Now, initially, many Choctaws were scheduled for transportation by wagon, but that didn't work because of the flooding, certainly one way to impede the progress. The citizens of Vicksburg and Memphis were pretty apprehensive about all this too, due to dwindling food supplies. 5 steamboats transported Choctaws to their new destinations. The Memphis group journeyed approximately 60 miles up the Arkansas River to Arkansas Post. Is that Arkansas or Arkansas? Americans tell me in the comments. Now, the temperature remained below freezing for about a week, resulting in rivers obstructed by ice, so impeding traffic for several weeks. Food rationing comprised a limited portion of boiled maize, a single turnip, and 2 delicious cups of hot water daily. 40 government wagons were dispatched to Arkansas Post for transportation to Little Rock. The Vicksburg contingent was directed by an inept guide who actually became disoriented in the Lake Providence marshes. In 1831, the French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville observed the expulsion of the Choctaw people while in Memphis, Tennessee, and he wrote about it in his work, Democracy in America. These are his words. In the whole scene, there was an air of ruin and destruction, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. The Indians were tranquil but somber and taciturn. There was one who could speak English, and of whom I asked why the Choctaws were leaving the country. To be free, he answered. Could never get any other reason out of him. We watched the expulsion of one of the most celebrated and ancient American peoples. Around 17,000 Choctaw people relocated to the area that later became known as Oklahoma, initially designated as Indian Territory. Between 2,500 and 6,000 of them died along the way. Now, the United States acquired Florida from Spain through the Adams-Onis Treaty and took control in 1821. In 1832, the Seminoles gathered at Payne's Landing along the Ocklawaha River. The Treaty of Payne's Landing required the Seminoles to move west, contingent on the suitability of the land. They were to be sent to the Creek Reservation and integrated into the Creek Nation, which viewed them as deserters. Some Seminoles had origins in Creek bands and other indigenous tribes. Now, realizing that the Seminoles would resist removal, Florida began preparing for conflict. The St. Augustine militia requested 500 muskets from the War Department. 500 volunteers were organized under Brigadier General Richard Cole. Indian war parties attacked farms and settlements, prompting residents to seek refuge in forts, larger towns, or just to leave the area entirely. A war party led by Osceola captured a Florida militia supply train, killing 8 guards and wounding 6 others. The militia recovered most of the stolen goods in a subsequent encounter a few days later. Sugar plantations along the Atlantic coast south of St. Augustine were destroyed, leading several enslaved individuals from these plantations to join the Seminoles. Now, there was also an incident on December 28, 1835, when a group of Seminoles and African Americans ambushed a U.S. Army unit traveling from Fort Brooke in Tampa to Fort King in Ocala. resulting in the deaths of all but 3 of the 110 soldiers. This event became known as the Dade Massacre. Well, other war leaders, such as Jumper and Black Seminoles Abraham and John Horse, continued the Seminole resistance against the military. The conflict ended in 1842 after a decade of brutal hostilities. The US government reportedly spent $20 million on the war, which is about $650 million in today's currency. Many indigenous people were forcibly relocated to Creek territories west of the Mississippi, while others sought refuge in the Everglades. But eventually, the government ceased efforts to subdue the Seminoles in their Everglades strongholds, allowing fewer than 500 of them to remain undisturbed. Some researchers assert that the several hundred Seminoles remained in the Everglades after the Seminole War. Now, after the War of 1812, many Muscogee chiefs, including William McIntosh and Chief Echota, signed treaties ceding additional land to Georgia. The ratification of the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814 marked the end for the Creek Nation and all indigenous peoples in the southern region. Leaders of the Friendly Creek, such as Echota and Big Warrior, communicated with Sharp Knife, the indigenous nickname for Andrew Jackson, to remind him of their role in maintaining peace. However, Jackson countered that they did not slit throat when they had the chance, referring to Tecumseh, so they must now relinquish Creek territories. Jackson also disregarded Article 9 of the Treaty of Ghent, which had restored sovereignty to indigenous peoples and their nations. Quickly forgot about that one, didn't he? Now, the Creek Confederacy passed a law making further land concessions a criminal offense. But despite this, on February 12, 1825, McIntosh and other leaders signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, ceding most of the remaining Creek lands in Georgia. After the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty, McIntosh was killed April 30th, 1825, by Creeks led by Menawa. The Creek National Council declared the Treaty of Indian Springs illegitimate. President John Quincy Adams sympathized and nullified it through the Treaty of Washington in 1826. Despite many Creeks being expelled from Georgia, about 20,000 Upper Creeks remained in Alabama. The state aimed to dismantle tribal governments and impose state laws upon them. Now, Opothle Yohala appealed to President Andrew Jackson for protection, but when none came, the Treaty of Echota was signed on March 24, 1832, dividing Creek lands into individual allotments. Creeks could sell their allotments and move west, or stay and submit to state laws. However, they were not given a fair chance to comply. Illegal land seizures by Americans continued unchecked, with authorities basically shrugging their shoulders and failing to intervene. Tensions escalated into open conflict after the destruction of Roanoke, Georgia, in May of 1836. During the Creek War of 1836, Secretary of War Lewis Cass ordered General Winfred Scott to end the conflict by forcibly relocating the Creeks west of the Mississippi River. So, by 1836, over 15,000 of them were indeed forcibly removed. About 3,500 died on the journey to their new settlement in Oklahoma. The Chickasaw received financial compensation from the U.S. for their lands east of the Mississippi River. In 1836, after a contentious 5-year negotiation, they purchased land from the previously displaced Choctaws, paying about $500,000, which is about 15 million in today's money, for the westernmost part of Choctaw territory. The first group of Chickasaws moved in 1837 under John M. Millard. On July 4th, 1837, they gathered in Memphis with all their possessions, including livestock and enslaved people. Crossing the Mississippi River, they followed trails previously used by the Choctaws and Creeks. Upon reaching Indian Territory, they assimilated with the Choctaw Nation. By 1838, over 2,000 Cherokee had voluntarily moved from Georgia to Indian Territory, now in Oklahoma. But the forced removals began in May 1838, when General Wilfred Scott received orders from President Martin Van Buren to remove any remaining Cherokees in the area. About 4,000 Cherokees died on the journey, known in Cherokee as the place where they cried, or the trail where they cried. The Trail of Tears resulted from enforcing the Treaty of New Echota, signed under the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now, during the 1830s, significant changes occurred in Cherokee gender relations due to this Indian Removal Act. Traditional matrilineal and matrilocal. Cherokee children belonged to their mother's clan, and women, they owned property, homes, and the children themselves. In fact, it's been noted by the naturalist William Bartram that marriage confers no entitlement for the husband over his wife's property. Upon separation, she retains custody of the children and their shared assets. However, in the 1820s and 30s, the Cherokee began adopting more Anglo-American authority structures, leading to a more male-dominated political system, and therefore subordination of women. Now, the Treaty of New Echota was mainly signed by men. Although women did attend the council discussing the treaty, they were not allowed to participate in the negotiations. This exclusion highlights the significant shift in women's roles within the Cherokee Nation due to colonial influence. As late as 1785, Cherokee women actively participated in land negotiations, such as the treaty at Hopewell, South Carolina. By the 1830s, this was unthinkable. One generation to change everything. It's funny how that works. Well, sparse Cherokee territories attracted Georgian farmers, leading to illegal encroachments. Tensions escalated after gold was discovered in Dahlonega, Georgia in 1829, sparking the Georgia Gold Rush. Gold speculators invaded Cherokee lands, increasing pressure to enforce the Compact of 1802, which the U.S. government promised to extinguish Indian land claims in Georgia. In 1830, Georgia tried to extend state laws over Cherokee lands, prompting the Cherokee to take the issue to the U.S. Supreme Court. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, the court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was not sovereign and just threw the entire case out. But we've already talked about that. But one interesting thing was this case was associated with Andrew Jackson's famous, though possibly apocryphal, mark, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Well, fearing conflict between federal troops and the Georgia militia, Jackson chose to take a step back and not support the Cherokee claims around Georgia. Now, the final treaty, narrowly approved by the Congress and signed by Jackson, was enforced by Van Buren. After the initial roundup, the U.S. military supervised the relocation to Oklahoma. 13,000 Cherokees, led by 7,000 militia and regular army soldiers. Most of the deaths along the way resulted from disease, starvation, and exposure to the cold winter. And so the march commenced 1838, predominantly on foot, many people without shoes, inadequately clothed, dredging through the snow. One can see how it was not a very safe march. Well, they set out from Red Clay, Tennessee, the site of the final eastern capital of the Cherokee Nation. Due to the sicknesses, the Indians were prohibited from entering the cities or the villages en route. Quarantining them this often necessitated significantly longer detours. Upon traversing Tennessee and Kentucky, they reached the Ohio River opposite Golconda in southern Illinois around December 3, 1838. The famished natives were assessed a fee of $1 per person to traverse the river via Berry's Ferry, which ordinarily charged 12 cents. They were denied passage until the ferry had accommodated all other individuals desiring to cross, and were compelled to seek refuge under Mantle Rock, a protective cliff on the Kentucky side, until Berry had no alternative engagements. Numerous individuals perished, clustered together at Mantle Rock, shivering while awaiting passage. A number of Cherokee individuals were actually killed by nearby residents. The Cherokee initiated legal action against the U.S. government at the Vienna courthouse, seeking $35 per individual for the burial of the slain Cherokee. On December 26, when they traversed southern Illinois, Martin Davis, the commissary agent for Moses Daniels' detachment, documented, "This is the coldest weather in Illinois I have experienced anywhere. The streams are all frozen over something like 8 or 10 inches thick. We are compelled to cut through the ice to get water for ourselves and animals. It snows here every 2 or 3 days at the farthest. We are now camped in Mississippi River swamp 4 miles from the river, and there is no possible chance of crossing the river for the numerous quantity of ice that comes floating down the river every day. We have only traveled 65 miles in the last month, including the time spent at this place, which has been about 3 weeks. It is unknown when we shall cross the river." The final distance of 60 miles, just shy of 100 kilometers, between the Mississippi and Ohio rivers was traversed on land, and it took them nearly 3 months to do it. The Cherokee lost the majority of their members while on the march through southern Illinois, but some Cherokee who wanted to keep their homes willingly picked a water-based route to the rivers of Tennessee, Ohio, and Mississippi a few years before they were forcibly removed. Even though it only took 21 days, the forcibly relocated Cherokee were reportedly afraid of water travel. Not only did the trail physically relocate the Native Americans, but it also forced them to contemplate the complete abandonment of their native land. And of course, that comes with a lot of cultural ramifications. You see, land itself was that integral part of Cherokee life. There was a spirit in every rock, every tree, every location. Everywhere had a story. Additionally, the tribe's way of life revolved around this spirituality. For many, the prospect of leaving behind their homeland meant abandoning their identity, their heritage, their entire way of life. The cultural shift in question is described by Gaileo Whitaker as an environmental deprivation, a term that relates to historical process of land and resource dispossession calculated to bring about the destruction of the indigenous Americans' lives and customs. In this context, environmental deprivation means that the settlers and settler governments have actively worked to prevent Native Americans from having access to resources that are effectively essential to their cultural preservation and survival. Well, removed near Tahlequah, Oklahoma, came the first Cherokee settlers. The Treaty of New Echota was signed in 1835 by Major Ridge, who remarked that he had signed his own death warrant. Among the treaty party leaders, only Stand Watie managed to avoid assassination during the subsequent political upheaval, which resulted in the assassinations of Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot. Over time, the Cherokee population recovered somewhat, and now the Cherokees are actually the biggest group of natives in the U.S. Well, the removal was not always applicable. About 100 Cherokees managed to outwit the American soldiers and subsisted solely on land in Georgia and neighboring states. There was an exception for Cherokees who lived on privately owned property rather than tribally owned property. North Carolina was home to 400 Cherokees who were exempt from removal because they lived on land owned by a white man named William Holland Thomas. Thomas had been adopted by Cherokees when he was a boy, you see. Bit of a complex situation. Well, on July 24th, 1840, the Highland Messenger published an article stating that between 900 and 1,000 of these deluded beings are still hovering about the homes of their fathers in the counties of Macon and Cherokee, and that they are a great annoyance to the citizens who had intended to purchase the land in the area under false belief that the Cherokee had disappeared. The article also mentioned that President Martin Van Buren had spoken about how they are, in his opinion, free to go or stay. Go where? Stay where? Well, throughout history, a number of Cherokee speakers have shared their personal experiences and perspectives on the Trail of Tears and how it's impacted them. Several prominent Cherokee speakers from the 19th century, including John Ross, Richard Taylor, and a few more, resisted the United States government by delivering this speech. Major John Ross and Major Ridge, who served as Cherokee chief from 1828 to 66, set out on a speaking tour within the Cherokee Nation to foster unity among the tribal members. In his council address, Ross emphasized the importance of tribal unity, saying, "Much depends on our unity of sentiment and firmness of action in maintaining those sacred rights which we have ever enjoyed." The sentiment echoed throughout the Cherokee resistance movement. The state of Georgia's ban on Native Americans addressing an all-white court and persuading other Native Americans to stay put the amplified significance on speeches like this one by the Cherokee. And with that, we reach the end. A little bit depressing, isn't it? Now, unfortunately, all those little depressing little stories are peppered throughout history. But let's not harp on about that then, won't we? I will thank the top-tier supporters: Dark, Carrie, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fazabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, and JR. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video. As always, lots of love to you all. Good night.